On today's video, I'm going to teach you how to take an acoustic guitar recording that sounds like this into this. Alright guys, I've got Logic Pro pulled up, but I do want to let you know that you can do this type of thing in any DAW or any recording software that you have, as long as your software comes with standard stock plugins like compressors and reverbs. All right, so let's go ahead and listen to that guitar recording again. This is dry, no effects, no nothing. Here we go. All right, you know, that's not a bad sound, but it's a little woofy and a little muddy sounding, isn't it? So how did I record the guitar? Well, I used a microphone, one microphone, and I held it, I positioned it about 12 to 15 inches away from the guitar, and I also pointed it at the spot on the guitar where the neck meets the body. So that's about the 12th fret or so. That's a pretty common area to mic when you're miking an acoustic guitar. But this recording does have what a lot of acoustic guitar recordings has, and that is some mid-range woofiness. You know, it's a little muddy sounding. So the first thing I wanted to do was adjust that with an equalizer. So I pulled up the stock Logic Pro equalizer, and I did a couple of EQ moves. The first one is a high pass filter. So in other words, I select a low frequency and set it. Everything below that frequency is rolled off. Everything above that frequency passes through unaffected. And as you can see, I've got it set to 61 hertz. All right, so it just gets rid of a little, low frequency rumble. The next thing I did was look at the mid-range between about 100 and 400 hertz, and I kind of honed in on the 190 hertz range. Right there, 191 hertz. And this is where a lot of woofiness or muddiness in an acoustic guitar can show up. That's in the range of about 160, 150 to 300 hertz. So I added a parametric EQ band here, and I pulled down at right around 200 hertz, about 2.5 to 3 decibels. And then finally, I wanted to brighten up the tone a little bit, and so I used a high shelf filter at about 30.5 kilohertz, 3,500 hertz, and just to bring it up and make everything a little bit brighter. Here's what that sounds like. Let me go ahead and bypass it. And, it's not a huge difference, but you can hear when the EQ is engaged, everything brightens up a little bit and gets a little clearer. And we do need to really think about that 200 hertz range. Let me go ahead and mess with that a little bit. You'll hear it immediately. So that's a really critical range for acoustic guitar. You could hear when I raised the level there, everything got much more muddy and woofy. When I pulled it down, everything got clear, but then eventually got thinner sounding. All right, that's the EQ. Next up is a compressor. Now, why would I want a compressor on this signal? Well, basically to reduce the dynamic range. If you think about an acoustic guitar, there's typically a large range between loud and soft. And in some cases, it's a broad enough or a wide enough range that the recording really doesn't sound smooth. So using a compressor can help to reduce the dynamic range and get everything under control. So this is the stock Logic compressor. And a couple things to mention here. One is the threshold. That is the level at which the compressor is going to kick in. And I've got it set pretty low to negative 39 dB. That's really low. I've also got the compressor ratio set to 5:1. So once the signal gets louder than negative 39 and the compressor kicks in, it's going to compress at a 5:1 ratio. I've also got a fairly quick attack time, pretty quick, 4.5 milliseconds. I do want to kind of clamp down pretty quick, but I do want to let just a little bit of that guitar pick coming through. Release is also pretty quick at about 20 milliseconds. I can probably bump that up a little bit. And then let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. It's a big difference, isn't it? And as you can hear, when I've got that compressor engaged, it's really squished, and in fact, the sound is kind of pumping. You can hear the level kind of going up and down as I pick each note. In the Logic Pro compressor, there is a mix knob, and this allows you to mix in some of the dry signal with the compressed signal. So it's kind of another way of doing parallel compression. But what I'm going to do is reduce this about down to 80%. So 80% compressed, 20% dry signal. Let's listen to that. Yeah, now that's better. As I begin to mix in some of the dry signal, I get a little bit more of the finger, in this case it's a finger attack, which sounds nice, but I still get that squishiness that I'm looking for in this recording. You may not want as much compression as I'm adding in. It just depends on what you're going to be doing with the recording. Next up is the issue of mono. I mentioned I recorded this with one mic, so it is a mono recording straight down the center. I really want some stereo width, and this is where one of those free plugins that I mentioned come in. This is Polyverse Infected Mushroom Wider. I'll put a link to it in the video description below, but it's a really simple plugin and simply allows you to create a fake or faux stereo effect from a mono signal. Check this out. Whoa. All right, that's pretty darn cool, isn't it? I really like that a lot. So you can take a mono signal with wider and instantly turn it into a stereo signal. And the interesting thing is that it's still mono compatible. And this is one thing we're going to check here, is to make sure that when we add our effects in, that we don't lose the quality of the sound if we collapse the signal from stereo to mono. So I've got a direction mixer in Logic Pro set up. This is how you collapse to mono in Logic Pro, or at least one way. And so check this out when I go from stereo to mono by collapsing the signal. You know, it sounds good either way. This is really important in an age of small, smart speakers like Alexa or Apple HomePod or whatever you might have. When you're standing away from one single speaker like that, even if it's got little dinky stereo speakers inside, the signal begins to collapse just in the air as the sound emanates from the speaker. And so it's important to make sure that your signal sounds good when it's collapsed to mono. All right, we've got our signal compressed and EQ'd and stereoized, and I'm adding in another EQ. You might think, Bill, why a second EQ after the stereo widening? Well, simply put, is you're allowed to add more than one EQ if you wish, and in a lot of cases it's helpful to just adjust the EQ a little bit after compression, and in this case compression and stereo widening. So as you can see, it's very difficult to hear the difference. It's very subtle, but I just brought up the treble a little bit, and again rolled off a little bit more of the lows just to make sure that we've got our, kind of frequency range controlled. Super, super subtle. All right, we're compressed, we're EQ'd, we're stereoized, we're re-EQ'd. Now I wanted to add in a little bit of delay for some ambience. And I used the Logic Pro tape delay. If you're in another piece of software, just pick a stereo delay and you'll be kind of off in the same ballpark. I've got this tape delay set to dual mono, so it's basically like having a delay on the left and right channel. The left channel is set to 900 milliseconds, the right channel is set to about 600, and it's very low. Both channels are set to only 7% wet, so it's almost all dry. Here's what that sounds like. You hear that little bit of delay? Nice. I like that a lot. It's very subtle and just adds a little depth to the signal, and we're still mono compatible. If you know me, you're thinking, Bill, you're not done with just one delay, and you would be right, because I also want a reverb, and I added this in on the stereo master bus. I used the Logic Pro Chromaverb, and I'm using the concert hall reverb type. Chromaverb allows you to create EQ curves coming into the reverb and then leaving the reverb. So I've rolled off some lows and highs to create kind of a mid-rangey kind of reverb sound. And I should mention that I wanted a pretty long reverb tail, so I've got it set to decay at 10 seconds. Here's what it sounds like. Yeah, there's that long reverb tail. Now, let's check our mono compatibility and see what we're sounding like here. Now, I'm hearing just a little bit of phase cancellation, but that's from the reverb, and it sits behind the main guitar signal, so we're still okay. It just adds a little bit of kind of a modulating effect in the background when you collapse it to mono, but it still sounds good. All right, guys, we're still on the master bus, and I want to smooth things out still a little bit from the dynamic range perspective, because we've added in the stereo widening, the delay, and the reverb, and I want to make sure that the levels are kind of smoothed out. So I added in a compressor right after the reverb. Here's what that sounds like. Not bad, and as you can see from the needle here, it's not a ton of compression. It's hovering around maybe 2 to 3 dBs compression on the peaks. So this is typically called bus compression. There are compressors that are specialized for bus compression, but really you can use any compressor for the purpose of pulling the mix together. All right, the last piece is limiting, and I'm using 2 limiters to get the volume of this track up to where it should be for Spotify, Apple Music, or Bandcamp. So I'm using two limiters so that I can control the loudness. The first one at the top is the Logic Pro adaptive limiter. You can see I'm cranking the gain by a good bit by 11 decibels, and I'm keeping the output ceiling at 0 dB. That is going to feed into the standard Logic limiter, and I'm increasing the gain just a little bit more, but I'm keeping the output level at -1 dB, which is typically recommended for streaming platforms. Let me go ahead and play this portion again. I want you to watch the little meter here in the middle where it says reduction. That's how much the limiters are turning down the signal to keep it under 0 dB in the case of the adaptive limiter and -1 in the case of the regular limiter. So as you can hear, we're quite a bit louder, which is cool. And the adaptive limiter is not really working very hard, is it? There actually is a portion of the song that is even louder. And at this point, the adaptive limiter will work some, but where we're living right here, it's not loud enough to trigger the first limiter. And as you can see, the second limiter was just triggered a little bit. We play that again and you'll see it triggered just a bit. So there were a couple of peaks that were limited by about 3 dB, but they just for a split second. So that's great. I'm not over squishing the entire signal, but I'm getting it up into the range where I want it to be for Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Bandcamp, wherever I'm going to distribute this track. For more tips and tricks on recording ambient acoustic guitar, check out the playlist here, and I'll catch you all over on the next video.